So a couple of days ago we did the walk around on this beautiful 68 Hemi RT, and I explained that it was here because my buddy Ralph, say hi Ralph.
Hi. Hi guys.
My buddy Ralph, who does work over here for Streetside Classics, that's a lift in the background making that noise. He was tasked with getting this thing to run right. So he said if anything interesting pops up, we'll do an update on it. And you know what? So far there is some interesting things, and very common mistakes, common issues, quirks and idiosyncrasies that have to do with the Hemi. So I'll start with the running issue. The car ran fine, it idled good, and had good low speed response, good low speed acceleration, but nothing on the top end. Ballparking RPM like over what, about 3,000 RPM? It was just flat. So
I couldn't even get it to 3,000.
Couldn't even get it to 3,000 RPM.
25, 26s.
But it idled fine, it ran good. So after going over everything external, we realized it's probably something internal. And I think we need to check the cam timing on it, because it had the symptoms of a cam that was just installed way too far advanced. It happens. And sometimes it's not even that the cam is installed advanced. Sometimes when they grind a cam, it's ground with too much advance. It's a mistake that they make. So I says, well, let's check the cam timing on this thing. And this is where the interesting stuff started to happen. So for openers, on these cars, pulling the driver's side valve cover when it's got power brakes is no joke. It's just not easy. So we decided to pull the even side of the motor, the 2, 4, 6, 8 side, because number one cylinder is here. But you have to understand on these 1843657.2 engines, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Hemi or a wedge motor or a Chevy or anything that has that 1843657.2 firing order, number 1 and number 6 reach top dead center at the same time. So you can check the cam timing off of the number 6 cylinder the same way you would off the number 1 cylinder. So that's what we did. We popped the valve cover off, and I'm going to get to what I found in a minute. But first I want to go over some things that I see very common mistakes people make with 426 Hemis. So the first thing is pull the spark plugs out. First step of taking the valve cover off is take the spark plugs out. And so here's one of the plugs. That's rich, bro. Yeah. All right. Forget about the tune-up part of this, right? You see these things have these little washers on them. It's like crush washers. All right. On a 426 Hemi, and a slant 6 also for that matter, a dual tube slant 6, they both use those spark plug tubes. On these engines, you don't use that washer. Now years ago, when like way back in the day, when you would buy these spark plugs, they would come in the box with the washers separately, and you would install them or not install them depending on the application. Nowadays almost all of them come with the crush washers pre-installed. If you're going to use these plugs on a 426 Hemi, you have to snip these crush washers off, because these crush washers shoot through the bottom of the spark plug tube. So you just take a little snip, you snap them, you twist them off the way, and that's it, you're done. So that was problem number 1. We got plugs out. Not that this actually hurt taking the plugs out, I'm just showing you what not to do with these.
You can unscrew them.
Okay, well a lot of the times you can't.
Yeah.
A lot of times you can't.
This much.
All right. Then we're going to take the valve cover off. So take all the nuts off, bolts and nuts. And this is something you have to, this is a quirk, okay? Now obviously on something like a show quality restoration or show car, you don't want any chance of oil seeping anywhere on the engine, right? So you'll use new gaskets, of course, and lots of sealer, just to make sure. Well, you can't use that kind of sealer on a 426 Hemi. And I'll tell you why. The real estate that this thing covers is so great that when you glue it in place, you can't get leverage anywhere on it to pull it off. So what you end up having to do is go around the valve cover with a big screwdriver or a pinch bar and slowly, work it up, and it invariably bends the lip of the valve cover. See, if like this was a wedge engine, narrow valve cover, you could seal it like that, and what'll happen is you can, after you take all of the hardware off, you could pry gently and either whack it with your fist or a mallet. You give it a few taps and the seal will break. You don't have that option with a 426 Hemi because it's so expansive. So if you ever find yourself where you're doing valve cover gaskets on one of these engines, you can glue it to the cover, but don't use any glue. Make sure there's no glue that gets between the gasket and the cylinder head, or you'll have a nightmare taking this thing off. Back when we were racing these, we would use talcum powder. We'd use a rubber gasket and coat it with talcum powder to make sure that they wouldn't stick. But that's that. So let's talk about the engine. Look at the Mopar. So once we had the valve cover off, we wanted to check cam timing based on the number 6 cylinder. These two rockers, this one and this one. So we rolled the motor to top dead center of the exhaust stroke, which would be split overlap, and the plan was to lay a straight edge across the valves with the rockers all completely loosened. So we loosened the jam nuts and took all of the adjustment out of the rockers, which is where we realized our first issue is that this engine does not have a solid cam. Originally 1969 and earlier 426 Hemis all had solid lifter cams. 1970 426 Hemi, they went to a hydraulic cam. So there's no lash on these. If anything, is actually preload. Now I've always set the hydraulic Hemis to 0 lash. The factory recommendation for it is for a half a turn, which is approximately 10 or 12 thousandths of preload into the lifter. About the same as what you'd find on a normal engine. But what we found on these was that the adjusters were absolutely buried into the lifters. What that'll do is, as the oil pressure comes up, the lifter is going to want to pump up. And that mimics the problem that we had with this thing, the drivability problem. Because now you get above 2,500, 3,000 RPM, the oil pressure comes up, the valve train is not really being loaded, and so it'll start to pump up the lifters. And as it pumps up the lifters, the motor falls on its face. So that was what we had there. Well, what we found so far. The cam timing, now we couldn't check the cam timing on this, and I'll show you why. We were able to lay a straight edge across these 3 valve springs. Now I know this is not exactly accurate. This is supposed to be done off the lifters. But if you can't get to the lifters for whatever reason, you can at least get an idea what your cam timing is going this way. So top dead center exhaust stroke, split overlap. The intake and the exhaust should be open exactly the same amount. The point is they should both be open. Well, what we found now is we laid a straight edge across the intakes, and the intakes were all at exactly the right height. But when we laid a straight edge across the exhausts, we found that the exhaust for the number 6 cylinder is sunk about 30 thousandths of an inch. So we put our there's no load on the rockers now, and we put on any of these rockers, and we put our straight edge across, and we were actually able to rock it back and forth on the number 6 exhaust. So there went any chance of being able to get accurate cam timing information from that. It's a common thing. You know, I would have expected if the head had gone through like real machine work that all of the valve heights would have been equalized, but they weren't. And number 6, we didn't check any of the others, but number 6 is definitely sunk a little bit. But then there was another thing too, and that was the exhaust rocker on number 4. So can we see in here? Let's get the light. So you can hang on. There we go. So you can see that the rocker, the tip of the rocker, is not riding on the center of the valve stem. It's riding off to the back side of the stem. When we loosened this adjuster, here off, it was like, okay. when we loosened this adjuster, the rocker arm itself moved back. So the rocker was not riding against the shaft. The rocker was riding probably 20 or 30 thousandths of an inch off the shaft. Now it's relaxed right now because we just put it back the way, you know, just back together again for the time being. But this rocker had ridden off the shaft, and when we loosened the adjuster nut, the rocker came back. Now even with the rocker flush to the stand, okay, so here's the stand and here's the rocker, and you see they're flush, the tip is still riding off to the back side over here, which means that this rocker is bent. And that's a very common thing. Hemi, if the Hemi has any one real fragile bit, it's the exhaust rockers. And those are the early street Hemi style narrow pad exhaust rockers. Now if this thing had, if this engine had been pieced together at some point where the rockers came from like a race car that may have seen, you know, heavy valve springs, and there's a good chance it didn't bend from trauma, it just bent because that's what they do. Over time they just walk away. So that's what we had with that. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. But at any rate, Ralph, the next step Ralph has here is going to liberate the power booster, get this valve cover off, set the lash at 0 all the way across, and then fire the motor up, retime it, and see if that solves all the issues. And then we'll come back. We'll take this thing for a ride and see if it's all figured out. So that's it. A quick bit on Hemi idiosyncrasies and quirks. I'll see you tomorrow.